CSCOPE documents that we'll be looking at as well.
We have like 2 more, so you'll just have to tell us when you're ready for those if you need it.
I don't know what those 2 more might be. They might actually be included in here.
Okay.
Those are actually in this one that's stapled.
Okay, so we don't need these.
No, ma'am.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Are we ready to roll here? Okay. I wanted to start, before I got into CSCOPE, what it is and how we use it in Tyler, I wanted to set the stage to give some context to why it is that we use CSCOPE in Tyler ISD. And it all starts with our state curriculum standards. Our standards are called the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. And those standards are developed by various committees, which TEA spearheads. We have teachers involved in that, curriculum experts, as well as community leaders. They determine what our standards will be, or our texts, which we sometimes use that term, or you might hear the term TEKS, referring to our standards. And then those are finally approved by the State Board of Education. And once those are approved, they are entered into our Texas Administrative Code. And at that point, school districts across Texas are required to teach those standards to their students. Now, those standards can be seen on the TEA website, and you can see a picture of that website along with the address. You would go to the curriculum link, which appears on the left-hand side of the page, near the top. And when you get to the curriculum link, you'll see near the bottom of the page a link for the curriculum standards /text. You will hear that the standards are also referred to as text. We use those terms interchangeably. So if you hear me say standards, I'm also referring to text, or Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. So this is basically what it looks like. If you were to click on one of those standards for a particular grade level, this is 3rd grade reading. So it starts out with the introduction, and then we have a list of all of the standards that fall under that content area. And to give you a visual of what that might look like, this is a page that shows us all of the standards that a typical 3rd grade teacher would be responsible for teaching for English, reading, math, science, and social studies. So it's quite a bit of standards, and they aren't organized in any particular way. It's just a list of standards for us to go by. So we know that TA needs to make sure that our kids are learning these standards, and we had an assessment system called TAKS, the Texas Assessment of Knowledge and Skills, but we have now moved into a new assessment system, which is STAR, the State of Texas Assessment of Academic Readiness. And it's quite a difference. We are undergoing a big transition in the change of this accountability or assessment system. And it's important for us to understand how different it is, because with a different assessment system and different expectations, we need to make sure as a district that we are making the needed changes so our students are successful. So I wanted you to see a couple examples of some of our test items from TAKS and from STAR, just so you can see the difference in rigor. On the left-hand side of this slide, you will see a math item from TAKS. This is 3rd grade. And on the right is a STAR released math item. Both of these assess the same standard. But if you look at them, and I'll give you a moment to read through them, I'm sure one thing that you're noticing is the TAKS item can be solved in one step. It's a pretty basic adding problem. However, the problem on the right, which is one of our STAR released items, needs to be solved in 2 steps, and you can actually come up with 2 different ways to solve that, and perhaps one of you might be able to come up with a 3rd way to solve that. So even though we're talking about the same standards, the test items are quite different now with STAR. So what we're learning about the STAR math assessments in particular is that they are very cognitively complex questions. We did have a few questions like that on TAKS, but in STAR, it's not a few, it's predominantly all throughout our STAR assessments. We also have many more questions that require multiple steps for students to solve, even as you see in this example, starting in 3rd grade. And another thing that's very new with our STAR assessment is we have some items that assess 2 standards or 2 texts at the same time. And we did not have that with TAKS. So now we're looking at a very different way of assessing student learning. Now for reading, I wanted to provide you with a couple examples there. And what you can see on the left is a reading item from 4th grade TAKS. And then on the right is a reading item that was released from STAR 4th grade. And the question is pretty much identical. Students have to identify a difference between 2 passages. But when we look at that a little bit closer, we can see that those items, those answer choices on the TAKS side are pretty short. They're all quite different from each other, and they're all very literal. Students don't have to infer, they don't have to draw conclusions. They just have to have a literal understanding of the 2 passages. When we look at the STAR distractors or answer choices, we can see that they're much longer and they're very similar to each other. So it's going to take a lot more thinking on the part of a student to read through those. And some of those answer choices will require students to make an inference, which is a much higher level of thinking, having to infer the motivation of some of the characters in these selections. So what we're seeing on our reading assessments is they do require more critical and inferential thinking on the part of our students. And it goes beyond literal understanding, which is pretty much what the TAKS was mainly about. And they also require students to use text evidence. So they're not just answering a question, but they have to be able to give a defense or give a rationale for their answer choice. So this is different. Overall, the rigor of STAR, the difference between STAR and TAKS with all of our content areas, is we have increased cognitive levels on the assessment items. We have more difficult answer choices that are much more similar. And there will often be 2 answers that sound pretty darn good, but one sounds a bit better than the other. And that's a tough process for a student to think through when you have answer choices that are similar like that. There are longer readings for the students. The tests are longer as well. And now they're timed. So students have 4 hours to complete the test, whereas with TAKS it was an untimed test. So we can see that the bar is being raised for our students. So what CSCOPE helps us do is it gives us tools to help meet that higher expectation, to get over that raised bar. And some of the tools I will be going into momentarily, but they help us sequence those texts or those standards. As you saw, the TEA website does not sequence the standards for us. It's just a list of standards. And it's up to districts to determine in what order to teach them and which standards we might teach together in a unit. So CSCOPE helps us to do that. CSCOPE also helps us deconstruct the standards. It provides us documents that take the standards apart so we can better understand them. And it helps us assess learning at a rigor that's consistent with STAR. As you saw in those examples, a lot of our TAKS resources are not going to help students prepare for STAR. And really, very importantly, is it gives our teachers, our educators within the district, a common language in talking about planning and assessing and talking about our standards, and a common process in how we learn our standards, how we plan our lessons, how we might assess our students. So we're working more systemically. What you'll see on this slide are the content areas that are assessed or, provided in CSCOPE. These are all of the core content areas. You can see on the left K through 8, and then on the right our high school courses are listed there. So the components of CSCOPE. And before I get into the specifics on the components, I do want to make it really clear that CSCOPE is really a product of Texas educators. CSCOPE was born with it was a brainchild of a few individuals working in some of our service centers who realized that we had some difficulty understanding standards. Some of our standards were rather vague, were kind of broad. And so the service centers wanted to provide some tools to help us better understand those standards. So there were about 6 or 7 educational service centers that got together and decided to create some tools to help districts. And that has grown now to where we have every service center participating in this collaborative. And we call that the Texas Education Service Center Curriculum Collaborative. You might see that acronym on some of our CSCOPE documents. The board of directors for CSCOPE is made up of our executive directors at each of our service centers. And most of the documents are actually created by teachers and service center employees who are working collaboratively. So it's definitely a homegrown Texas product. So our main components. There are several components in CSCOPE, but I won't go over all of them due to time. These are the components that we use the most here in Tyler. The vertical alignment documents, the years at a glance, the instructional focus documents, the exemplar lessons, and the unit tests. And you do have examples of those in this packet with the exception of a unit test that is not included. So first I want to talk a little bit about the vertical alignment documents that our teachers use when they are planning a lesson. These documents help a teacher see how a concept develops over the space of 3 years. So for example, if a teacher is teaching rational numbers, which is the example that I provided for you, a teacher can see exactly what that looks like in 6th grade, how that particular concept changes in 7th grade, and then how it looks in 8th grade. And that provides teachers really critical information on what they need to teach and how they might fill gaps that students might have. The vertical alignment document also takes the standards apart. It helps the teacher see all the pieces of a standard so they can understand it more fully. And it provides specificity. You'll notice that there is blue text here on the slide, and all of the text that appears in blue is a specificity that the CSCOPE developers have added to this document. Everything else comes straight from TEA. CSCOPE developers just ordered it for us so we could see those vertical connections. The specificities are very helpful because they give us more detail about each of those standards. What the CSCOPE developers have done is they've poured through all of the resources that TEA has provided to us over the years. They've gone through released tax tests, information booklets, study guides, anything that's come out of TEA to see exactly how that particular standard might be assessed. And they added that information to this document, again, to deepen teachers' understandings of those standards. This is an example that you have, and in the red rectangle at the top is the actual standard straight off of the TEA website. And then you can see in the green, this is when I say deconstruct, this is an example of deconstructing. What we have here are the cognitive processes pulled out of the standard and separated, so teachers can see exactly what thought processes the students need to be engaged in. And then underneath that, we have some of the specific content that we want to make sure our students are learning. So all of this is not available through any other commercial resource, but only through CSCOPE. What I'd like you to do is listen for a moment to some of our teachers in Tyler ISD talk about how they use the vertical alignment document in their planning.
We use our vertical alignment document, also known as our VAD, during our PLCs for math. We discuss them on Monday, discuss what we're teaching and how it interacts on each grade level. And then on Fridays, when we come back in, we discuss how it worked, what needs to be tweaked and worked on to make sure that our students are successful once they leave the 6th grade, go into the 7th, and once they leave 7th, go into 8th, and 8th on into high school.
We've worked for the first time this year, even with high school teachers, in seeing exactly what they see deficits in when students get to the 9th grade, and that's helped us in 8th, 7th, and 6th as well. So the vertical alignment document is useful to help us make sure that the students know what the teachers will expect them to know in the coming years. The thing that I like the most about it is aligning terminology. So if in the 6th grade we're using controlling idea statement, and in the 7th they're still using that, but I know because I teach 8th grade too, that I need to start transitioning students from controlling idea to thesis, because by the time they get to the 9th grade, the vertical alignment document will use that terminology. Then it just helps us to help students, especially with that terminology, as it changes as students mature. And we can make sure that they're prepared, and the teacher doesn't throw thesis out there and the kids panic because they've never heard that terminology before. So that's the way we use the vertical alignment document in language arts.
If they're struggling to make the connection in the classroom with what I'm teaching, I can go back and pull in that previous knowledge just by looking at the vertical alignment document.
We use the vertical alignment document in our PLCs when we are planning. We like to look at what our students are coming to us already knowing and where they need to be when they leave us.
Okay, next document. This is our year at a glance. Thank you, Reverend Mason, for being our light technician. Appreciate that. What we have in the year at a glance, as you can see, you do have a sample of that in your other packet. It was right after the vertical alignment excerpt, if you want to flip through that to see a closer copy. What you can see here is we have all of the standards that are taught. This is an example of social studies in 8th grade. And they're divided up into units, and then they are sequenced throughout the school year. And this gives us very important information for our planning. It helps us realize that first of all, we're going to get all of the standards taught, because that's really important. We make sure that no standards are left out on the year at a glance. And we make sure that the sequence makes sense for our students. Those standards that are particularly difficult to teach, those appear in the year at a glance multiple times. So we always revisit those to deepen the student's understanding. So we can see how these standards, I know you can't tell just by looking at the numbers, but these are standards that all relate to each other. They make sense to be taught together in a unit. And if you count the days that the units take within each of those 6 weeks periods, you will realize that they add up to 25 days. And typically, a 6 weeks period contains 30 days. Not always, but typically. This gives us some space. If a teacher is absent and comes back and needs an extra day to catch up her students with what they missed when she was out, or if teachers realize that they need to spend another day on a particular lesson that student struggled with, they have the ability to make adjustments in how many days they might want to spend on a particular lesson. And we also want to make sure that those standards that will be assessed on STAR, that they are taught before the STAR administration. So this year at a glance is very helpful to our teachers in their planning process. And now we have another video clip. You can hear exactly what our teachers have to say about the year at a glance.
The year at a glance is really helpful to us in the language arts department because whenever we first began working with CSCOPE, it was kind of nerve-wracking to see that we only had a set number of days to cover a skill. I wasn't confident that I could get everything in on a particular skill. For example, a short story unit. Can I teach depth of dynamic characterization? Can I really get to setting if we only have this number of days? So by looking at the year at a glance, it helped us to plan that I can cover the basics in this unit in this 6 weeks, and the year at a glance will spiral back in the later 6 weeks where we can get the depth into the lesson that we intend for the students to move forward with.
We can see like ahead what subject matter we're going to cover, maybe where we need to spend more time, less time, and we use like last year's test data to look back and see kind of the alignment. But it's one of those documents that has helped us with time. I mean, it helps us to structure our planning. Here, like our professional learning communities, it really helps.
There are units that they give us 9 days and it takes the kids 12 days to master. So it kind of balances itself out because we know, like for example, division, I know that the 10 days it gives me to teach division, my kids aren't going to master it in 10 days. So usually I plan for about 12 days. And that way, you know, if I have 12 days here, then there may be another unit that says 10 days and I only take 8, so that kind of balances out. But I don't ever feel like it's, okay, I have 6 days to teach this and that's it.
So you can see the flexibility that we definitely want to provide our teachers in following that year at a glance. The next document that I wanted to introduce to you is the instructional focus document. And you have actually the entire document in your packet right after the year at a glance. You can find it there. And this is a pretty lengthy document. It has a lot of information. And what this document does is it takes a unit. Now we're kind of, the year at a glance was a global view, but now with the instructional focus document, we're zeroing in on a specific unit. And what a teacher can find within that instructional focus document is all of this text or the standards that are taught in that unit, along with those specificities that I had talked about, that additional information to help us better understand that standard. There's a section in the IFD in the very beginning called a rationale. And in that rationale, there is an explanation into what the kids are learning in this unit and how it connects to previous learning and how it is going to prepare students for future learning. So teachers can see how this fits into the continuum of teaching. There's key vocabulary included in the instructional focus document. And one of the elements that the teachers particularly find helpful is the misconceptions and underdeveloped understandings. This is a section in the IFD that alerts teachers to what kids might have trouble with when they come into this unit, what misconceptions they might be bringing forward, what are some of their misunderstandings, and it helps the teachers prepare for that and to be mindful to watch out for that type of thinking on the part of their students. The instructional focus document also includes something called a performance indicator. And a performance indicator is a type of an assessment. It is a project or a task that students perform that incorporates multiple standards. So rather than assessing 1 or 2 standards at a time in our traditional tests that we're more familiar with, now we have an actual authentic task for students to perform that can give us even more insight into their depth of understanding of those standards. And again, we have some teachers talking about the instructional focus document and how helpful it is to them. I like how y'all are taking turns with the lights. That's teamwork.
The instructional focus document just really allows us to come together as a team, get our main focus, and how we can teach it on our separate levels, our separate classrooms. So it's just a very, very big focus on what needs to be done for our students.
I use that just at the start of every unit, and specifically some of the things that I'm first looking at are misconceptions. That's one of the first places. Like, we already have laid out what we're going to teach the 6 weeks because of the year at a glance. I have that stuff. And so as I open up the unit, say Unit 9, one of the first things you see on, I think it's like page 2-ish, is those student misconceptions. And so as a team, we'll talk about we haven't presented this to the students, but it provides us some of that insight. The other part is that in the very beginning, the opening, it really kind of gives us a little bit, just a hint of where they're coming from and what that bridge that I need to establish for next year. The other part that I really enjoy is the performance indicators. We take those big performance indicators and pour them into a PowerPoint. And so on Monday, we'll show the kids the performance indicator is. It's a multi-part question that's overwhelming. And then we'll break it down on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They do just a little portion each day so that by Friday they can look back and we see that every part's been answered and met. So it's just one big problem that we work on continuously.
Key vocabulary is in there, which is a very kind of important factor because at least on our campus, we have to focus strictly on vocabulary. We have a lot of LEP learners, those that are trying to learn English. They're learning English and science terms at the same time, and that's a challenge, but that document has helped in that aspect and keep us on track with the language standards and T standards that we follow.
Okay, the next document that we're going to look at are the unit assessments. And teachers use the unit assessments in many different ways. The district does not mandate how they use them. This year we wanted to provide as much flexibility in their decision making on how they might want to use those. And what you see on the screen right now is what the test key looks like for a unit assessment. You will notice we have some columns on the right-hand side of the test key that are headed primary SE, that's student expectation, and then secondary student expectation. That's the standard that that particular test item assesses. And you can see many of the test items, particularly on this test key, are assessing 2 standards at the same time. There aren't a lot of commercial products out there that do that yet. That's something new with STAR. And it takes a while sometimes for our commercial publishers and vendors to understand and learn more about the STAR and start providing us materials that truly do align with the STAR assessment and with the standards. So at CSCOPE, we're able to get some really good, rigorous items that have that dual coding, as we term it. I wanted you to see an example of a question from a 4th grade unit test, just so you can get a sense of how that rigor appears in a unit test. This is a geometry question, and if you take a look, I put a rectangle around some of the terminology. And what you'll notice here is this particular test item is very rich in its academic vocabulary. So students need to know these terms. They need to own these terms in order to answer this question. So there's a great bit of rigor that's embedded just within the type of words that are used in this item. Now let's look at the standard that this item assesses. It's 4.8a. Use essential attributes to define 2- and 3-dimensional geometric figures. It's a pretty short standard, and it seems to be pretty cut and dry. But when we look at it closer, we might wonder, well, which attributes are essential? And one teacher might have a different viewpoint on that than another teacher. Another aspect of the standard, which could give us different thinking, is it's asking for 2- and 3-dimensional geometric figures, but which ones? There are a lot of 2- and 3-dimensional figures. Which ones do we teach in 4th grade? So you could have teachers within the same school who approach the standard very differently. And we really don't want that to happen. We want to make sure that our students aren't getting any gaps in their education. So to refer back to the vertical alignment document, this is what teachers find out about that standard when they use that vertical alignment document. Here in blue, you can see exactly which of those essential attributes are that we want to make sure that those students know. And then we can see exactly which of the 2 and 3-dimensional figures those students in 4th grade are responsible for. So it helps us be consistent in what's happening in our 4th grade classrooms across the district. And another little note, what we often find in the VAD are some extra notes that the CSCOPE developers provide for us. For example, in regards to this standard, this is the first time 4th graders are going to hear about acute right and obtuse angles. And that's good information for a 4th grade teacher to have, that those students have no prior knowledge of those particular points, and she needs to be very mindful of that she's introducing it for the first time. And then here we will have some teachers talking about how they use the unit assessments.
I actually enjoy the unit assessments just because the questions are already made for us. We use them as more of a teaching tool for ourselves, for our students. So when we give the unit assessments for the students, we go over our most missed questions. We try to analyze with the students why they missed that question or what they did wrong, what tricked them, what they feel tricked them, to make sure that we identify that so we won't have that same issue later on. And I think that I've seen that in most of my students because of their growth.
The unit assessments are imperative because not only does it just give teachers grades, but gives us the chance to see how we're teaching, what we're teaching, and if the students are really getting it. And so what I'm able to do is once they turn in their unit assessments and they get their grades and we're able to put it into a WARE program, but we can go back and look at those low objectives that those students are not understanding. And so I'm able to go back into the classroom and get with those students that need that extra help, and I can do that assessment piece or that objective that they're low in.
Since we aren't certain and the STAR is so new, we're not certain what terminology will be used in the questioning, exactly what it will look like. So using those unit tests to preview ahead of time with planning, it kind of gives us a better focus on what types of questions I should be asking my students in the classroom during the lessons.
And the last component that we'll look at today is the exemplar lesson component. And in your packet, what you have is a social studies lesson on economics. And each lesson pretty much looks very similar to this one. What's important and helpful about these lessons is they are free of any commercial products or any textbook references. So they're not tied to any particular resource. It doesn't matter what textbook a district might have adopted. It doesn't matter what resources a teacher might have. She would be able to still use this lesson if she chooses to do that. It includes important vocabulary terms so we can keep that academic language a major part of instruction, as you saw in that sample test item that had a lot of that academic terminology for geometry. We need to make sure that we're teaching that in our lessons. And what we encourage teachers to do is to take a look at these lessons and see how that might work for their students, if there's something they might want to add or delete or adapt, or perhaps use an entirely different lesson. The only non-negotiable is whatever lesson the teachers choose to use, that it be aligned to our standards. We need to maintain that alignment. That is critical. And here we'll hear from our teachers again.
I use the exemplar lessons to work with my students. I use them to make sure that they are understanding the material. I try to do a lot of hands-on activities with those, just depending on what they are. One of the ones for probability we were able to pull out our manipulatives to add on to the lesson. So they got to see a visual and they got to have something hands-on to touch and use. And I think they helped them gain a better understanding of the work that we're doing today. I know there are children learning many different ways and there are so many different multiple intelligences. And I know not everyone is on the same level in every classroom. So we try to do a variety just to make sure that we're hitting every area possible. Just to make sure that our lower students are understanding, our higher students are still engaged, and that we won't be missing anyone in the meantime.
My lessons today are way different from what I did my first year. My first year I was on course with the CSCOPE. I was every word for word, but now I'm able to adapt the lessons.
The exemplar lessons really touch on the skills where the students have to build. And one thing I find with pretty much the majority of the exemplar lessons that I'm using is that sometimes there's just a small portion of it that I will pull because it meets the kids where they're at now. The next lesson might work from the ground up because it might be a lesson that they already have a strong enough foundation in that I can start with that exemplar lesson. But a lot of the times I take bits and pieces of those different lessons and just apply. Sometimes I spread them out. Some of the exemplar lessons we use through the year that now during STAR review I'm going back and pulling different parts of those. Or hopefully I can have I'm being presented those options where now I can really use the whole exemplar lesson because they have a foundation coming into the review time. And so now it's a great not only review, but it's allowing them to kind of pull everything together and actually take it a step farther, even during review time.
Once it became clear that it was a suggested lesson, it was an example lesson, exemplar lesson, and that we still had the freedom to teach the lesson the way that we chose, ways that were tried and true, that we knew could create success on student testing, then it became a tool that we could really use, and we found that the good parts of it instead of just looking at the negative parts of the lessons that we didn't think would work.
So just to kind of summarize some facts about CSCOPE, you've seen what some of those components are and how teachers use them. I wanted to emphasize that the CSCOPE staff regularly review and revise the components. So as we learn more about STAR, for example, then that is integrated, that new information is integrated into these resources. For example, some of our vertical alignment documents will have special STAR notes for teachers, things to be aware of. This is how it might look on STAR. So all of that information is updated as we learn more and more about that assessment. Also, our texts, our standards, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, change on a regular basis. In fact, soon we'll be having a new set of math standards that our students will be responsible for learning. And the nice thing about CSCOPE is all of their materials get updated with the new standards. Unfortunately, when we adopt a textbook that can stay in a classroom for 6, 7, 8 years, possibly even more, even though there might have been changes in the standards, that textbook is static. And CSCOPE does not do that. It stays very current with what's happening through the state legislature. You heard one of the teachers in one of the videos mention language standards. We do have other sets of standards that our students need to learn. The English Language Proficiency Standards, also called ELPS, and the College and Career Readiness Standards, CCRS. And those are all integrated into the CSCOPE document, so teachers don't see those as separate standards. When you look at our TA website, those are listed separately. But CSCOPE brings them all together and helps teachers see how they relate to each other. And when there are changes in those, then those adjustments are made in our documents. So with that online collaborative feedback feature, on every single document on the CSCOPE website, there is a collaborative feedback button. So if a teacher notices something in the lesson that she thinks might be a factual error, or a question, a test item that she has a question about that she thinks might not be an accurate question, or it might not be an appropriate question, teachers can submit feedback to the CSCOPE developers. This also works if teachers find typos, misspelled words perhaps, an answer choice that's repeated on a test document. And in my experience, when I've submitted collaborative feedback, I generally hear back from the CSCOPE developers in about 2 to 3 days. So there's a pretty good response rate to that type of feedback. So what we have with CSCOPE is a resource that teachers use along with textbooks and other instructional materials that campuses have accumulated over the years. And we have a system to organize these standards in a way that makes them comprehensible and doable for the teacher and for the student. What CSCOPE is not, it's not designed to eliminate textbooks or other instructional materials. It's a tool to help us better look at textbooks and instructional materials and determine, is this something that is aligned to our standards? Is this something we want to use in our classroom? And as you can see in all of these various components to CSCOPE, it's certainly not a quick fix. Learning our standards, developing that understanding, not only of the standards a particular teacher teaches, but vertically, what the previous teacher is responsible for, what the next teacher needs to accomplish with her students. We are really asking a lot more of our teachers than ever before, so it's certainly not a quick fix for anybody. And it is not scripted. Although the exemplar lessons do have questions that are written out, if teachers choose to use them, it's not designed to be read off the page verbatim. You might recall one of the teachers who spoke about the exemplar lessons said that she used them when she was a first-year teacher, but then as she gained confidence and grew in her knowledge of the standards, that she was much more comfortable adapting those lessons to meet the needs of her children. There's a website that anyone can go to learn more about CSCOPE, www.cscope.us. And on this particular website, you can find press releases and other information about CSCOPE, even responses to some of the criticisms or controversies that have come up of late. So this is a great resource for people who are interested in learning more about CSCOPE. There is also a parent portal that's specifically designed for parents who want to learn more about CSCOPE and how that might be impacting their children in the classroom. Now this parent portal is going to be changed quite a bit. As a result of the recent State Board of Education hearings, the CSCOPE developers have really increased their efforts to communicate with our parents. So the new parent portal, which will be rolling out in the next school year, is going to have a lot more information for our parents, and we're looking forward to that. I wanted to end with some overall comments of the teachers. I asked them to talk about some general statements that they wanted the board members to know about in regards to CSCOPE.
CSCOPE has given me a guide on my curriculum. It wasn't like I started teaching and I didn't know where to begin. You know, CSCOPE has helped me, I feel, become a better teacher because it has given me a starting point. And, you know, I've never used it where I had to do the lesson verbatim. You know, the questioning was exactly what CSCOPE said to ask. It's always just been a resource for me to use.
With CSCOPE, just over the years in the use of CSCOPE, I have really seen, just as the kids come up to me that are staying consistently in a Tyler school, that are using CSCOPE, it's really changed the whole layout of what the kids look like in all subject areas. Coming to me as fourth grade, like the gaps that we started out with when I first started teaching here were huge. And every year that we implement CSCOPE and we implement all the documents that go along with CSCOPE and we put them into play and we actually use them and learn them, you know, those gaps of those students are closing and closing and closing.
I was just thinking, imagine a world where every teacher buys into CSCOPE. How much easier each of our lives would be. Because I would know, instead of telling my students that I know your teacher taught you coordinating conjunctions or subordinating conjunctions or relative pronouns last year, and hoping that was true, because I didn't know for certain that it was, but if I knew with certainty that every teacher, every year, had really bought in and it allowed CSCOPE to drive their lessons throughout the year, then I would know with confidence that every skill had been taught before, and I would know from the vertical alignment document what terminology was used. I could tie to that from year to year, and you know, by the time these guys were moving on to the 9th grade, there wouldn't be anything that they couldn't do.
So that's the conclusion of the PowerPoint. So at this time, I would welcome any questions that you might have.